Uh, Today, we are really honored to have Dr. Roy Sudharshan Canagarajah with us, and he will be engaging in a conversation with Professor Makoni on the future of Africa. So, Dr. Roy Sudharshan Canagarajah is a development economist whose work focuses on inclusive growth, fiscal reform, trade, and climate resilience in emerging and developing economies. Over a career spanning more than 3 decades at the World Bank, he has led major policy initiatives across Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe, mobilizing over 100 million US dollars in global support and fostering partnerships with governments, UN agencies, and international donors. Dr. Kanagaraja earned his PhD and Master of Philosophy in Economics from the University of Cambridge. He has held teaching and research appointments at leading institutions, including the University of Cambridge, the University of Warwick, Cornell University, and Georgetown University. His academic work bridges rigorous economic research with applied policy, emphasizing evidence-based solutions to development challenges. A committed mentor, Dr. Kanagaraja has guided numerous students and young professionals pursuing careers in international development. His research and professional practice reflect a sustained commitment to integrity, collaboration, and innovation in advancing equitable and sustainable economic growth. Welcome again, Dr. Kanagaraja. The floor is yours.
Good. Yes. Okay. Since this is a conversation between me and Roy, I want to start by asking a very pedantic question, then we can get into more details. When you look back now at your experiences at the World Bank, what were the highs and lows of that experience? And then we can get down into more specific questions.
First of all, thank you very much. I'm very delighted to be here this morning. And thank you, Professor Makoni, for giving the opportunity for me to interact and collaborate with the School of African Studies at the Penn State. And thank you, Osge, for all the support and guidance on connecting with you today, and for the very elaborate introduction. I am humbled to be able to be here. So let me start the question and say, also kind of contextualize it for Africa. So my, as Osge said already, what happened is that I started my college studies in Sri Lanka. I got a scholarship and went to Cambridge to do my master's and PhD. While I was there, that's the first time I came across a lot of African students and a lot of people from Africa. And because I was doing PhD there, I was doing tutoring as part of business. And then I got to know a lot of African mid-career professionals, policymakers, diplomats coming and studying there. And I was teaching a course called Quantitative Development Economics. And I really was fascinated with Africa because everything they were writing, essays, classwork, which I had to read. And I was getting interested in these places. I have never seen Africa. I have never been to Africa at the time as a young student. So I was really fascinated. Then I came to Cornell as a postdoc. And my research at Cornell was about, at the time, there was a Washington Consensus, as it was called. Basically, Bretton Woods institutions were trying to fix various challenges in Africa. And I was doing a lot of research as part of that. It was called Structural Adjustment Program. I don't know how many of you know that word. It was very, very popular word globally, but much hated in Africa. And I had done a lot of research on that. And many of my papers were very critical of the World Bank and the IMF at the time. And they invited me to come and join, like today, do some seminars so that their staff can understand what I found. And interestingly, a lot of people were very keen, they were very open-minded. And I was saying how they had gone wrong in trying to, with good intentions, trying to do things, but they had gone wrong. And after I went for one seminar, then after a month, they asked me another seminar. A lot of people were there. And they asked me whether I would come and join the Africa department. So that brings me to the question, Professor Makoni, you said, the first task I was doing was a report on the seminal report on poverty in Africa in mid-90s. And I was young, a blue-eyed boy, just going there and seeing what is this happening, trying to understand Africa. And I remember going to a meeting with all the senior people in the World Bank at that time and to meet the head of the state. And the head of state said, I don't like the topic that you are doing research on. I don't like to be talking about poverty in my country. I like to talk about prosperity in my country. So I did that report. And based on that, I wrote a paper because the head of state said that he didn't like poverty. And the paper was called Poverty in a Wealthy Economy. And that paper was published in Journal of African Economics, which was a journal that comes from Oxford University. And it's interestingly one of the kind of popular papers I have written because I really analyzed the poverty in Nigeria at that time, which is a wealthy economy. They produce at that time 1 million barrels of oil a day. And there's no reason they should have 40% poverty in that country. So in some sense, despite doing a very technical PhD, I thought that's an interesting highlight of my work. The second highlight I will say in Africa is that, of course, I worked in Africa for a long time and worked at various levels with interacting with high-level policymakers. And the second highlight was me going and living in Africa with my family in Uganda. And that was, again, an eye-opener. Rather than being somebody who was going as an international civil servant, going and living with people and touching and feeling the real issues of Africa really was a very important learning experience for me. Now, naturally, Professor Makoni, with all the things that I have done, nowadays people think I am an expert on Africa. So I really want to humbly submit to you, I am a student of Africa. And my objective, in this lecture and also the spring course I am being invited to teach by Professor Makoni is to make sure I take students on the journey that I have been to learn about Africa and the fascination that I developed. It's an economy with so much potential, but also so many challenges. So that's why I like to kind of think about the topic I am doing. Is the future Africa?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. And what's your answer to that question? Is the future Africa? What's your response to that rhetorical question that you posed for yourself?
That's a good question. In some sense, what I feel is that there's a lot has been written on Africa. And so my answer to that question is that, first of all, Africa is a very vibrant economy. And Africa has, when I talk about Africa, by the way, I'm talking about what in the literature is called sub-Saharan Africa, which is 48 countries. It doesn't deal with the 7 countries in the Northern Africa. So that's the data we normally have when we talk about Africa. And this continent is very rich in many ways. First of all, in the last 25 years, Africa as a continent has grown by 4% on average, compared to global growth of 3%. And even economies like United States are 2%. So you can see this is an economy that is growing in the last quarter of a century. And the potential of that growth is still very high. That's the first point. The second point I will say is that at the moment, Africa has 1.5 billion people. In the turn of the middle of the century, it'll be 2.5 billion people. So this population is going to be in the center of anything that happens globally. If Africa succeeds, the global economy will succeed. If Africa fails, the global economy will fail. So that's the second point I want to make. The third point, there are 600 million youth at the moment in Africa. And they need jobs. And that jobs has to come from success and growth in Africa. And it cannot happen without the rest of the world participating in that growth as investors, as producers, as consumers of the goods and services produced in Africa. So it is very important to remember that Africa has so much potential. I know many of you in this lecture hear about Africa when there's a crisis, when there's a famine, when there's a political coup. But unfortunately, that is very little and far between. But unfortunately, that's what hits the Western news. But what is happening in Africa is much more. And we need to understand this continent if we are really serious about global citizenship.
So your argument, let me put it in a more rhetorically dramatic way. Are you saying that for the globe to succeed finally, Africa has to succeed? Right.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Now, if that is the case, then what are the concrete, specific suggestions, strategies that you would recommend? Choose any African country of your choice. And assuming you were having a fireside chat with the Minister for Finance or Economic Planning, and they said, Roy, can you advise us on what concrete strategies we could adopt to try and make sure that this particular country, X, let's say Zambia, Ghana, Zimbabwe, whatever, succeeds? What would be the concrete strategies that you would propose?
That's a very good question, Professor Makoni. I think, Africa is predominantly an agrarian economy. There's a lot of agriculture that is taking place in Africa. In fact, Africa's economic growth and population growth is not always complemented with the growth in food production. So there's a challenge of food security, which means agriculture has to be a key area of growth for Africa. Now, people who in the lecture know about agriculture know what is called Green Revolution, which basically modified peasant agriculture into commercially successful production systems, which means modernization, uses modern technologies and scientific improvements in crop growth and productivity. These things have to be very integral part of the future of Africa. Secondly, more than half of African countries, out of the 48, almost 26 countries are called resource-rich economies. What do we mean by that? They have oil, they have gas, they have minerals. More than 60% of the minerals needed for just transition in terms of climate change at the moment is in Africa. But a lot of the resources are being kind of taken by the investors, but not processed in Africa. So a lot of the wealth that is created in Africa is not benefiting Africa. So we need to make sure that many of these things that are there in Africa needs to be processed
within Africa.
Like, for example, in Indonesia, they had nickel. Now, all these years, nickel was being taken away by Western countries and processed and sold at a higher price. But then Indonesia, few years ago, said, no, we want you to come and invest here and process it here and give jobs to our people. And now Indonesia is a high-income country because they are growing because of that asset they have. That's the second part. The third area which is challenging in Africa is many of the African countries, because of the wealth is not internalized, they also have a lot of debt. And that is something that we need to address. We need to be able to manage the debt in a sustainable way, because many of them are poor countries. They need to borrow, that's not a problem, but it is the ability to pay back the money you borrow. And that means you need to make sure that the resources that come into the country are invested in productive way, so they can actually lead to growth, jobs, and poverty reduction. Let me stop.
Okay, good. Yeah, let me then jump in here again and say that given Africa's exposure to climate shocks, how can countries pursue growth strategies that are both resilient and low carbon, right? We have talked about how the African countries may need to be able to process those minerals within Africa, but what about how do we develop African polities and states that are at least climate resilient to climate changes?
It's a very important question. And this is one of the questions that currently I'm reflecting on, also as part of the work I'm doing at the World Bank. So the whole global economy is trying to see how to reduce the emissions from fossil fuels. And this is a battle that we are losing. You know, there are so many extreme weather events globally at the moment. And it's very clear scientifically that it is happening because of the emissions that actually have been emitted by the users over the years. So once you emit, it's very difficult to do anything. It'll live in the space for a long time, and it'll have its harmful effects on not just on weather, but on health, on agriculture, etc. Interestingly, a large share of the potential to change this is also in Africa. As I said, about 60% of the minerals that we need is in Africa. And if you don't mind, maybe I can show is there a way I can show a map? I don't know. Anyway, because my computer I'm not connected on the computer, so I have a map I can show. But anyway, the basic thing is, it's important to know that there's so much potential of Africa with mineral resources which are necessary to transform that. Secondly, one of the thing is to diversify sources of energy. And one of the sources of energy is solar. And basically, Africa has one of the highest potential of solar energy in the world. And what we are trying to see, and in the last 10 years, the cost of producing solar energy has declined by 90%. That means it's much cheaper to produce solar energy than any other alternative source of energy. So we should actually exploit that. But unfortunately, at the moment, China, which is the major knowledge hub of solar energy, is actually benefiting from this investment because there's no capacity in Africa to develop, maintain, and sell these energy sources. So China is the one who is doing that. So one way to do that in Africa is to make sure that we get this technology, absorb it and internalize it, and then produce energy. The second thing is there are so many hydro energy plants in Africa, which can more than give access to electricity to all the people. At the moment, Africa has less than 50% access to energy. And we need to increase the access to energy, and especially electricity. If we do that, then we will also help Africa grow faster. And this is why it's important that we invest in sources of energy, all types of energy, so that Africa can grow, and both in terms of economy, but also in terms of the potential to reduce poverty.
But what role do you think African universities can play in this future view of Africa that you have been talking about?
Now, that's a very good question. I think at the moment we see Africa is still, has substantially improved over the last 25 years. We see that Africa has increased the amount of primary education, secondary education, but tertiary education is still very low. So we need to increase tertiary education so that they can access, technology. They can, become the experts in all the new technological developments and bring it back home and use it to the growth and development of the continent. And this means we need to invest in courses and expertise that African population can benefit from. So that is going to be an important challenge at the moment for Africa.
Good. Okay, let me stop here because I think my other colleagues would like to come in. Oski, let me hand over to you. Right.
Okay. Thank you for this fascinating engagement. Now we are opening our session to the audience. Please go ahead, Professor
Cecile.
Cecile. You are muted.
You are muted, Cecile.
Sorry. Thank you very much for this conversation, and it's very nice to see one of the faces of the World Bank.
I hope you like the face. Not as you
I do
imagine,
like
it's
the
not
face.
scary.
I'm not sure I like what is promoted by the World Bank, but anyway. So I've got several questions, but I just want to ask you a very candid question first, and then. So how would you define economy? Because we talk a lot about economic development, etc. What is your definition of economy? So we can start from, we can lay the ground of, what we are talking about.
Okay.
Thank you.
So thank you for that question. I think, the definition of an economy is the factors of production and the sources of production that we have. And in a very narrow sense, economists use a term called GDP, which is called gross domestic product, which basically adds up all the value of things that were produced in a country, in a company, in a society, and use that as an indicator of the progress they are making in economy. So that is the narrow definition. But in a broader definition, in order to get this GDP, we need a lot of factors. So we need not just hardware, we need software as well. We need not just more mineral resources, as I was saying earlier, we need also things which are like the human capacity, human knowledge, institutions which are able to translate the potential rather than allow things to be wasted. Governance is very important because it's important to have the ability to be effective and efficient in managing a country and the leadership. So these are all factors that are very integral part of an economy. And what happens in a country will be determined not by the mineral or resource endowments that the country has, but how people and institutions come together to transform and translate the resources into more opportunities, more resources, and more growth for the country. I hope that helps to understand.
Yes, thank you. And I wanted you to reflect on citation by Schumacher, 1977, in a book called Small is Beautiful. I don't know if you are familiar.
Yes.
And he says the common criterion of success, namely the growth of GNP, is utterly misleading and, in fact, must of necessity lead to phenomena which can only be described as neocolonialism. What is your take on that?
No, I think that's a good point. I think it is true that, just using the indicator of a number as, a country is growing or not growing is very limited in terms of. So there are many people who have come with alternative indicators. People have, human development indicators, wealth indicators, and I think all of them show that we need to have a diversity of indicators to understand phenomena of an economy. The same way, just to use an example, if you want to describe a person, like you were saying about, you have seen me as from World Bank. So there are many ways to explain about me, about my education, about my current job, about where I live, about what I do, what is my credentials, what is the way I'm using those credentials. So in some sense, you need a composite of indicators to understand. So I think it is true that we should be not, be kind of limited to gross national product as an indicator of wealth of an economy. As I said, we need to understand institutions. In fact, Schumacher actually provided that as the beginning of looking at institutions, because governance is more important than how much you have in your hand, how you use that, and how do institutions. And this is one of the challenges Africa has. When I look at the future of Africa, it is not about the potential. It is these challenges of some institutions, some political periods have shown that it was not always very effectively used. So I think I agree with that. Thank you.
And last question, if there is nobody else. Yeah. So there are economists who have worked on economic development, and they have, especially from the global north, and one of the reasons they explain the lack of economic development of the African continent is the diversity of languages. And they have argued, which I am opposed to, but they have argued that the high level of ethnic diversity in Africa actually contribute to, and I cite Easterly and Levin, I don't know if you are...
Yes.
And they say, while not fully accounting for Africa's growth performance, the extraordinary high levels of ethnic diversity in Africa importantly contribute to our understanding of Africa's growth tragedy. What is your take on that?
No, I think it is true. Fortunately, I worked with them at some stage. They were in the World Bank at some stage. Both of them. They were very eclectic thinkers and writers. So I think it's true. Africa has a lot of potential, but it needs to be realized. And in order to realize, you have to kind of definitely invest in the factors that translate that potential into possibilities. And this is why it's important to focus on education. It's important to focus on institutions. It's important to focus on improving governance, reducing corruption, increasing the access to knowledge and technology. Those are important. And, that's what is globally it's showing. Other countries which have succeeded globally have done it only because they were able to use the things they have and to realize the potential that they have. So I think it's true. We shouldn't really focus on just making the growth an end in itself, but it's a means to an end. What is the mean? What is the end we are trying to do? In this course, in fact, I am hoping to teach in spring. I'm going to talk about poverty, because if you want to reduce the poverty globally, you need to take the resources and make sure that everybody is able to share in that. Now, at the moment, I'm trying to see, my computer is not connected, so I'm trying to see if I can get some numbers. So at the moment, as you know, globally, poverty has been declining. And in Africa especially, the poverty has declined substantially in the last 25 years, from about 62% to 46%. But in a country that I am living in, with the United States, at the same period, poverty has more than doubled, from 0.5% to 1.2%. Of course, it's small. What does that show? It shows that wealth has to be equally distributed. So rich people becoming richer will still add to the GDP, but then it will not benefit everybody. So that's why it's important to make sure that we are making growth egalitarian growth. It is not growth of some people. The top 10 people in the United States are richer than whole of Africa. So that's really a travesty. So this is the problem we have, because growth in itself is not going to be egalitarian until you are able to help others participate and benefit from it.
But I just wanted, because I think you haven't answered my question.
No, sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
And my question relates to ethnic diversity, because that's the point of Easterly and Levin.
Yeah.
Okay. And the point of other economists has been that because Africa is highly multilingual and ethnically diverse, it impedes the growth, the economic growth of the countries. So what I'm trying to, because you seem to agree with that. So what I'm trying to understand is how there is this kind of correlation between ethnic diversity and lack of economic growth. I don't understand. As a linguist, I don't understand. I'm not an economist. So could you explain to me in very lay terms why there is, why it's the case or why economists believe so?
No, I think that's this is a very complex topic. First of all, I'm not an expert. So I think just, again, looking at some of the countries I lived in the East Africa, there's a lot of ethnicities. So when one ethnic group comes to power, then it tries to kind of suppress others. And that is, a common phenomena historically. Global history very clearly shows the one ethnic group comes, they help their own ethnic group, they don't help others. So that kind of perpetuates the problem of one set of people benefiting at the expense of all the others.
And which was orchestrated by colonization, by the colonizers.
I agree.
So it's quite a recent phenomenon, historically.
Exactly. Very, very true. Yeah. I fully agree with you. But that is something we need to kind of understand. That is much more entrenched phenomena of ethnicity superimposing their preferences over what is the national good is something very tricky. And I don't want to make, again, I'm not an expert, I will say, I don't want to make it to sound like some or other language is a constraint to growth. I don't think so. In fact, all languages have been able to show, like the largest amount of knowledge at the moment, they say, you probably know better than me, is in Chinese. But they're not a global language in many ways, but they have all the knowledge globally at the moment in Chinese translation, which is good because that shows they are interested in ensuring they acquire the knowledge to become better. Now, why I say that is that language diversity has its benefits. And therefore, we shouldn't say that just because you speak one language, you cannot participate in economic growth. There's very little to show that. People from all languages are able to benefit from it. And similarly, I would like to think that ethnically, there's nothing inherently wrong about one ethnic group participating in the growth. It's just that the ability of that ethnic group to diversify the benefits and share it with others is the problem that historically we see. The particular example you brought in on the colonization is very good. What did the colonial, masters or mistresses were interested in? They were trying to exploit the resources and take it back to their country. They did not invest enough in the colonies. That's why, the post-colonial history is showing how many of these governments have become very nationalist or nationalistic in terms of ensuring that the resources in their country is protected and not, let go outside. But the neo-colonial history is showing that it's difficult. Even today, the Western countries, not just Western countries alone, even China is able to benefit from the resources in Africa. Now we are talking about Africa. Yeah. Not because they are able to take the resources and take it back home and make double the amount of money. And the argument I made earlier is that we should ensure that Africa tells these people, yes, come in, but can we process it here? Can we also benefit and share in the wealth that is being created? And unfortunately, Africa is not doing much of it at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Excuse me to speak out of turn, but I think that there is still, I am still not convinced. Take Somalia, take Rwanda, take Burundi. They don't have extensive multilingualism or multilingualism at all, but they are not more developed than the other African countries. And moreover, while the government may be dominated by members of a particular ethnic group, the larger population is not more developed than the other populations in the country. So the problem is elsewhere. It's not really in multi-ethnicity. And you take China, China is highly multilingual too, but China is making a lot of progress. So the solution, China may have found it that other countries have not found yet.
No, I fully agree with you, Professor. It's very important to remember. I fully ascribe to your fact, which is what I also implied. Language alone is not going to be a factor that determines the creation of wealth or success economically. Neither is ethnicity. So I think we shouldn't necessarily. There are many other factors. So I feel that understanding economy by one single lens limits us from appreciating the diversity that is created. As you rightly said, China is multilingual, and also there are ethnic diversities, and still they are able to grow dramatically in the last century. And it is clear that they have, one of the statistics on the poverty is that they have almost eliminated poverty. So between 1990 and 2022, China and East Asia were 67% poor, more than Africa in 1990. Today, their poverty is 2%, which shows that they have been able to do things despite their diversity that we think is there. So diversity is not a constraint for economic success. It is possibly a good thing to have diversity. There's nothing wrong about having diversity ethnically, linguistically, and it's very important to. And that's why. And every country doesn't have the same resources. Every country doesn't have the same potential. So they are able to. That's why, the other challenge we have in Africa is about trade. One of the things we see is globally, Africa is trying to do a lot of trade globally, but there's very little intra-African trade. There's so much potential. So, when I was living in East Africa, there's a lot of goods coming from England to Nairobi than from Rwanda, Uganda to Nairobi. Why? Because, the trade routes are kind of connected in different ways, thanks probably to the colonial history, and that we need to break out if you really want to grow and be successful. Anyway, let me stop here. Thanks.
We have a question or comment from Onaja Christian. Please go ahead.
Afternoon from here. Thank you very much, Professor Roy, for your wonderful presentations.
Yeah.
I would love to ask first and foremost, how would you define economic development? There has been some level of debate, amongst decolonial scholars that the word development is first and foremost a Western origin. And all these indices and metrics of development, GDP, which you have mentioned, are Western centric, that somehow they do not in any way reflect the nature of development that should be African per se. So I want to learn from you, how would you define economic, or do you imagine a definition of economic development that is, predominantly African? That's my first question.
Okay. So I think it's a very, again, a multifaceted question, a good question. One thing is, in this course that we are going to talk about in spring, we are trying to make sure economic development is also about poverty reduction, because we want to make sure that everybody is able to have a decent living, the ability to, consume the food they need, to invest in education, to invest in their health. And that, globally today, they are saying we need at least $3 per day in dollar terms in each country for each person. Now, naturally, from that metric, at the moment, Africa is still having almost half its population poor, 46%. So that means we have to make sure that we help everybody. It's not about the GDP of the country. It's about how many people are able to benefit from that GDP. So that's what we are trying to do. So my definition, again, as I was working in Africa, has always been to use poverty as an indicator, because that if people don't have the ability to have a job and earn a living, then that is basic concept of human development, and we need to get there, and Africa has to get there, irrespective of all the other definitional problem. We have to make sure that every African has the ability to have the resources to feed him or her and their families and meet the needs.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Prof. I think you're quite explicit with your explanation. The second question I want to throw to you is this. I once watched a video where a certain Tunisian professor was being interviewed. I think his name is Professor Fadel Kaboub. And then the question posed to him was, what was the greatest lie that has ever been told about Africa? And then he said that Africa is poor. And then he outlined the fact that, just as you mentioned in the course of your presentation, that Africa is blessed with enormous human and natural resources. But if you listen to some reports from World Bank, United Nations Development Reports, and all that, they still point to the fact that Africa is that the least developed countries in the world, are drawn from Africa. But this is not an isolated case. You can't say they are lying, because if you take a mental flight about the nature of lives, in Africa, you admit to the fact that somehow or the other there is something fundamentally wrong with the continent, as you mentioned, with respect to the nature of poverty that is still affecting the continent. Now, you gave a hope to me. I saw it as a light of optimism when you said that the success of Africa presupposes the success of the world. That's excellent, and that to me, it's an air of optimism. But I want to know to whose hand does this success of Africa to begin with lie in? Somewhere last month, the American president Donald Trump gave warning to Nigeria that if they do not stop the series of killings going on in the country, that they would come. Now, that particular comment made the government to stand on their toes. And somehow, magically, things begin to unfold in a positive dimension. And then this speaks to the extent in which the West, I will use the word external force, has some level of influence on Africa. I also listened to a video where the president of Uganda, Museveni, was saying that when Libya was in tatters, that a group of African leaders wanted to intervene, and while they were about to embark on that particular journey, they received a call from NATO that they should go back, that NATO hasn't spoken. And then the rest is stories. So my question is, who is to bring about this success? Is it the West or Africans? Knowing too well that somehow or the other, the hands of Africans tends to be tied. Of course, when you read the works of decolonial scholars, they continue to make an observation to the fact that the independence that Africa is bequeathed to in the 60s is but a sham independence. So how will you react to this, Prof?
Okay. No, these are a lot of questions. We have to sit down and talk a little bit more on each of these topics. There are a lot of very important topics there. Let me say, first of all, I think it's sad that the world is trying to write the history of Africa in a way that it is dependent on the West, which is wrong. It will never happen. I don't think there's any altruism in the West that they are going to help Africa. The same was true of colonial history. And similarly, China has grown on its own. If it was left to the West, they will not have grown. They will be suppressed. And the same is going to be true for Africa. Africa has to rise up on its own. African leaders have to take what is best for their countries. But unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, and the political history, which I am not an expert on, the governance and institutions and leaderships and corruption and everything doesn't help at the moment Africa going in that direction. So Africa's future, as I still believe, is in the hands of Africans. And Africa has to rise up and kind of own it, materialize it, and share it. And then it'll be able to make sure the rest of the world understands how they are important for the global economy. But it's very clear when you have when I compare the population growth globally, it's clear that all the countries in Europe, in East Asia, in United States, they are all going to have by 2050 lower number of working age population than today. Whereas in Africa, you will have double the population. That is a wealth. The people who are going to contribute the future talent, the future creativity, the future entrepreneurship is in Africa. And if there's global markets, if there are investment flows, where should it go? It should go to Africa. It's very clear. But if Africa is not in a place where it's able to benefit from that because of its own internal problems, then you cannot blame the West for that. So I think we need to make sure that Africa rises up and owns this potential and realizes this potential. Because while I say that there's so much potential in Africa, there are also so many challenges in Africa. And how do you overcome those challenges is going to determine how much of this potential that I am talking about is going to materialize. So it is in the hands of Africans, and it can be realized the same way China has realized, Africa can realize. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions or comments?
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
Who, me?
Yes. Sorry.
Thank you. I wanted to touch on informal economy, which according to numbers, it seems to be the most thriving economy in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. So I wanted your thoughts on how do you see informal economy, in the sense that when I try to trace the discourse on informal economy, especially from ILO, International Labour Organization. I say that for my colleagues.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, I remember in the 1970s, it was like, oh, informal economy is, is an indicator that the economy is not going well, blah, blah, blah. And a few decades later, it seems that there are programs now to encourage informal economy, which is now associated to entrepreneurship, so you have programs where, women who have done that perfectly are taught how to, manage a budget, etc., according to Western standards, etc. So, what is your thoughts on informal economy and economic development? Do you see that do you think that it's an indicator that the economy doesn't go well? Or do you think that it's actually maybe a way to reframe, the ways in which economy, is thought about?
Good question. In fact, I have written a small paper sometime back, about 15 years ago, on this topic. First of all, this idea of formal, informal in a dichotomic sense is flawed.
Yeah.
Because I don't think there's a dichotomous,
Yeah.
it's a continuum. So
Yeah.
people become, everybody does formal and informal work, and some of which are in a company, some of which are outside the company.
Right.
Many people will do that, and there's nothing wrong about it, first of all. But it is true that a large share of Africa has more informality. So a couple of things, let's say, at the moment, only about 5% of the population in Africa has a formal sector job. It's pretty small compared to the rest of the world. And so naturally, it is important to increase people who are able to get jobs in the formal sector. Now, that doesn't mean there are not enough people to employ the jobs. So let's say if 20% of the population is, with more than tertiary education, they have the ability to be in the formal sector, but there are no formal sector jobs. So this means it is important for us to make sure investments are there in formal sector jobs. Now, this is a more complex topic, because just because you want to create a company doesn't mean you can create it and people will come and work and you will make money. No, you have to be able to sell the thing. So it's a kind of so it's not just investment, it's the ability to make those investments, be productive, and those productive investments leads to outputs. Those outputs are sold in other countries, so then people are employed. So in some sense, I think it's true that we have even the statistics show that in urban areas, even in most of the rural areas in Africa, 100% is informal, because they are doing peasant farming, small, medium scale enterprises at household level, which is fine. There's nothing wrong about that. But that in the urban areas, even 60% of the population is informal. In most of the cities in Africa, they are not working informal sector jobs with monthly salaries or whatever. They are working in various variety of entrepreneurial activities. Now, I wouldn't say all informal sector jobs are bad or they indicate they are poor. Some informal sector jobs are very, very lucrative. So I think we need to remember that. But definitely we need to, this is also another dimension which I mentioned earlier. When you have an economy which is agrarian and there's not enough modern industries and manufacturing sector, then it does lead to informality. That's one thing. Secondly, as I said earlier, despite the fact that we have so much of the global mineral wealth in Africa, we are unable to actually use that to create wealth in Africa. It is being taken away and produced by people in the West, whether to do Tesla or whether to do different kind of innovation. The wealth, the actual mineral is in Africa. So it's very important to make sure that we internalize those wealth manufacturing sector in Africa, and it's not happening. So that is because people will say there is no institutions, there's no governance, there is no trade routes for them to benefit from that, so they have to take it back to China or United States to produce things. So that is what is happening. But I think you are absolutely right in saying there's a pervasive informality in Africa. Now, I don't necessarily feel that is wrong as long as you can make it work profitably. But I think it is necessary to increase the share of formality so that people who are educated don't leave Africa to go to the West to work. They can work in Africa if they have the companies there. And that has increased a lot in the last 100 years. Very few people who are educated in Africa come to the West. They are still living in Africa, contributing to Africa, have major industries in Africa and major institutions in Africa. So I think we need to do more.
Yeah, but the deindustrialization, sorry, it's a very hard word for me to pronounce, was also driven by the Washington Consensus, where the IMF and the World Bank imposed, this drastic structural adjustment that totally destabilized, African economies. So now, after these, drastic measures were taken by these two supranational institutions, so there is a kind of contradiction in a way, because we need to build more industries, blah, blah, blah. But, in the 1980s, measures were taken to destroy these industries and, a big part of the, the economic structures of the country. So how do you, deal with
I think this is what I told to the earlier person who asked the question. I don't think you should expect somebody from outside to come and save you. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that's flawed. That thinking is flawed. That is not something we should encourage anyway. No, whether it was the colonial masters or Washington Consensus is irrelevant. They have no altruism to take care of Africa per se.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's be clear about it in this audience. I'm speaking as a human being.
Right.
We don't need to expect somebody to come and save us. That's wrong.
Right.
Africa has to save itself. Why is that not happening is the question we should ask. We cannot keep complaining about somebody else coming to help us took away our things. That is really because we were weak and we were ill-informed. That's the way history will interpret it. So I think we need to make sure that Africa owns its future. Africa takes control of its future. Africa takes control of its resources and be able to materialize. As I said in the example, if so many minerals are there that is needed for just transition and modernization in the rest of the world, in Africa, but it's being taken away by other countries, let's say the West and China, and then they make money out of it. Whose problem is that? It's our problem in Africa. It's not their problem. They are exploiting our weakness. That's all they are doing. So we shouldn't kind of unnecessarily make it a problem that we cannot solve. We can solve this problem, but that's the only way to solve this. Africa rises up. That's it.
Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, I'd like to just tell how much I agree with you. And the one term that is missing, I think, is corruption. And corruption is endemic to Africa. And corruption, I think, is at the center of Africa's underdevelopment. Cecilia referred to informal economy as the most growing economy in Africa. Well, but we have to be very careful. People are learning to survive the plight of Africa through informal economy. If there were a more developed formal economy, the proportion of informal economy would be smaller. And more people would be at ease. And that would even bring an end to extensive migration out of Africa or brain drain out of Africa and those kinds of things. And you are very right, it's Africa that Africa should be thinking about solving its problem in African ways, African modern ways, because we cannot go back to pre-colonial Africa. And this is something that is not taking place. And I think that the African leadership, my colleagues here have heard me say this before. Africa has not stopped being a bunch of colonies of the Western world because Africa has remained in a state of dependency. It's like every time there is a crisis, let's go back to dairy, they will help us. And dairy is abroad. And in the economic system, Africa has maintained the setup left by the colonizers, get raw materials for the industrial revolution of Europe, and that is still what we are still doing. That's why, compounded with corruption, Africa is really stuck, or Africa is in the path of underdevelopment rather than in the path of development. I coined a term in my work called meta village in reference to African cities, that it is difficult to really speak of urbanization. You have extensive demographic growth in African cities, but there is no infrastructure development. There is no wealth and health care development. And so what you get in Africa when you take into account the demographic growth is a bunch of shanty residences growing around the old city left by the colonizers. And difficult to find water, difficult to find electricity, difficult to find a hospital, and all those kinds of things. Somebody who is a leader of the country must be too blind to notice these things, because
Or
the
too
rest of us
greedy.
see that this is not really, yes, too greedy too. The rest of us see that this is not really development, you know. So it's like African cities are becoming more and more rural-like rather than the other way around.
Sure.
So, but I really like your analysis and so forth. I promise I'm going to read your work. I didn't know before.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mercy, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Roy, for a very insightful talk. So my question is going to be on the future of renewable energies, particularly in Africa. You have spoken a lot about how the cost of production for solar energy has been decreasing for the past decade, like almost 90%. But I would like to know, how is this affordable in Africa? Because it's one thing saying that the cost of production has been reduced by 90% from the economic perspective, but when you take even that reduction and then you compare it to the economy of Africa, that one is still expensive. So I would like to hear your take on that. And I think that one is also tied to the fact that yes, we all know that we are having and we are facing extremes weather events because of the emissions and all that. But I'm still on the opinion that, like what you mentioned earlier, that people should be able to use their resources. So there are countries in Africa where they have been blessed with fossil fuels. And for me, I am the opinion that instead of keep on saying that all people should be going to the renewable energy, if it happens that the fossil fuels in that particular locality is affordable to that kind of economy, these people should be advised to utilize that means of energy for the development of the country. So I would like to know your take on that. But my second question will be on, you touched about how most African countries are doing well in terms of the primary and secondary education and how we are still lagging in tertiary education. And I kind of have a mixed feeling about that because I feel like sometimes with the way things are going, I feel like perhaps tertiary education is not very much of a solution based on based on where we are economically. So we still we are still in the level whereby we are doing a lot of I would say small kind of enterprises for the economy. And you have also said so much about the informal economies and formal economies. And where I coming from, for example, I come from Tanzania, like we have a lot of graduates. And right now, for example, even for this graduation, I think for PhDs only, we have been receiving, I think, almost close to 500 PhDs this year. But yeah, what we see with PhDs back home, it's you end up perhaps getting promoted and you won't publish. And even when you publish, perhaps whatever you're going to publish is going to be limited and all that. So a lot of graduates, especially the university, the first degree graduates, I mean, what they end up doing, they end up being like some of them decide to be farmers and all that. And I'm of the opinion that if this is where we are, perhaps the vocational kind of training would be more relevant to our economy rather than focusing, oh, we need to increase the number of people with like university degrees and stuff like that. So I would just like to hear your opinion, because I have had graduates who would graduate with a degree in architecture, but right now they are carpenters. And the reason is, and they'll tell you, like, I'm doing carpentry right now because there is no a place for me to actually practice my architectural profession. So I'm like, oh, if we invested serious in vocational education, or for example, the kind of high school here in the US where people do the basic skills like in carpentry, in woodwork and stuff like that, maybe we'd be able to help our economies better. So thank you. That
Good.
was just my thinking. Yeah.
Mercy, you have so much wealth of questions on these points you mentioned. We have to have a couple of coffees over this and talk about all these things. These are very, very important points. And also, let me try to address some of them. First of all, as I said earlier, since 1990, the Africa in the last 25, 30 years has really, more than doubled the investments in primary, secondary education. And we see the results. Primary school completion rate has become 69%, which is about almost 16% increase, which is good. Similarly, secondary school completion rate is increased by 20% to 44%. Youth literacy rate in Africa today is 79%, which is very good. Now, I fully agree, this is a broader topic. You guys are better than me on post-colonial Africa and how much of that, and I've forgotten, it was probably Salikoko who earlier spoke. If you take the Western education model and try to have PhDs, that's definitely not going to help you. So you need to have a model of education that is necessary for the economy of Africa. I also want to link this to the question Cecil asked earlier, where she was asking about formality, informality. So if you educate people for formal sector jobs, and then you don't have a formal sector, then that will lead to brain drain. There's no other option. No, they have to go somewhere to find a job. So we need to make sure that either it's kind of a, double-edged sword. On the one hand, your economy is informal, but you're having formal education. And those people are going to go somewhere else because they don't have jobs there at home. And if you want to increase the jobs of people staying home, then you have to increase the formal sector jobs for them. So I think this is the challenge for Africa. And you are absolutely right. We need more vocational oriented education as well. And how do we ensure that lower secondary schools or post-secondary school graduates, which are many in Africa, can become vocationally competent, competency-based vocational educations are very popular now in Africa. And it's good to do that because that will help them, without going to do the PhD and then becoming a carpenter, they can become a carpenter after secondary school. So which is good. They don't have to spend a lot of money and time on that. Now, let me get to the issue about energy, renewable energy, etc. I think you are right. If there is energy, all forms of energy is necessary, no? And so that is not something we can, talk about. And then we need to make sure all forms of energy is accessible. As I said in the beginning, Mercy, less than 50% of the African population has access to electricity. And if you take continuous access to electricity, it might be lower with the power cuts and blackouts and brownouts, it will be even lower. So which means we need to make sure access to electricity is a primary objective. Then we have to ask what kind of source of energy is needed. And then we have to talk about what is affordable. And this is where I am saying, and it is a global literature is saying, renewable energy used to be expensive, but not anymore. Most forms of renewable energy are becoming cheaper. And people are doing renewable energy not because it's a fashionable thing to do, but it's economically the most useful thing to do as well. It is also the right thing to do from a climate perspective. So I think it's important, what we do, in terms of choosing that form of electricity. It is necessary for you to make sure that you make the right choice based on your country. I hope that's helpful for you.
Okay, thank you.
I think now we can slightly move towards our after party. Thanks a lot, Dr. Canagarajah, for this engaging talk. I'll now give the floor to Professor Makoni for the closing comments.
Thank you very much for this. This was a very useful conversation because I think what it did was to show the multifaceted dimensions of discussions about the economy, informal, formal economy, education, etc. And I think the conversation was very helpful. And it was also very useful, I think, to hear you engage with Mercy and Cecile and Sally and everybody on different aspects about Africa and the direction that Africa might take. Now, what we tend to do after this, we move on to what we call an after party. But I think, Ozgi, you want to announce who is Ozgi will announce who is our next speaker.
So next Friday, we'll host Alexandra Ita Olsevska from the University of Oslo, Norway. And she will be talking about radical multilingual spaces of hope, counter stories of refugee background students in Poland. So
Okay,
welcome
thanks.
to attend.
Right. Okay. Now we can move on to